Hey there, my name's Niels and welcome to another Euphree video guide.
First up, let's remove the old crank. To do this, you'll need a specialized tool called a crank puller. You can find these at any bike shop. Just make sure you've got the right kind for your crank. A crank puller consists of two parts, the main body and the center screw. The screw is what slowly pushes the crank off of the spindle. Firstly, remove the chain from the crank. You don't need to remove it from the bike completely, just let it rest on the rear cassette. Next, use an Allen wrench to remove the bolt in the center of the crank. It might be a bit tough to get loose, but it'll come off with enough force. Once that's removed, screw the crank puller into the crank arm. Make sure it's nice and tight. Now that the puller is screwed into place, tighten the center screw. It will slowly begin to push the crank off of the spindle. Just be aware that it can take a significant amount of force, so slow and steady is the best way to do it. Eventually, the crank should pop off of the spindle. Once it's off, go ahead and remove the crank puller. Replacing the crank is a simpler process. The first thing you need is to grease the spindle. Try to keep the grease on the outer part of the spindle. The crank will push it further inward. Once you have the spindle greased up, slide on the crank. Be sure to double check its position. The crank arm should point in the opposite direction of the other crank arm. Place the bolt you removed at the start back on the spindle. Begin tightening it, and you'll see that it will slowly move the crank back down the spindle. Once again, this will take a while and can require a lot of force. A manual torque wrench is recommended. After the crank has been fully tightened, replace the chain by pulling the derailleur forward and looping it over the crank. Now you should be ready to ride. Take it slow during your next ride to make sure everything feels solid. If you think that your crank is loose, immediately stop riding and try tightening that center bolt again. Thanks for watching.